Picture this: a quiet Sunday afternoon in an upscale suburban neighborhood. A woman is walking her dog along the perfectly manicured sidewalks when suddenly she finds herself staring down the barrel of a gun. The person holding it? The HOA president, convinced she's caught a dangerous trespasser. What this HOA president doesn't know is that the woman she's threatening has spent the last 15 years protecting the most powerful person in the world. The woman standing calmly in front of that gun commands an elite team of Secret Service agents, has neutralized actual threats to national security, and is trained to disarm an attacker in less than 3 seconds. But here's where it gets even more unbelievable. The HOA president doesn't just threaten her once and back down. No, she doubles down. She calls the police, files complaints, and launches a campaign of harassment that would ultimately expose not just her own crimes, but an entire network of corruption running through this seemingly perfect neighborhood. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying tales of HOA overreach and instant karma you will ever hear. This is the story of how one power-hungry HOA president picked the absolute worst person to mess with, and how her actions set off a chain of events that would bring down an empire of petty tyranny built over decades. Marcus and Sarah Chen had been searching for their dream home for nearly 2 years. After countless weekends touring properties, they finally found it. A beautiful craftsman-style house in Riverside Meadows, an exclusive community about 40 minutes outside Washington, D.C. The neighborhood was everything they'd hoped for: tree-lined streets, pristine parks, a community pool, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. Sarah's job required absolute discretion about where she lived. As the deputy commander of the Presidential Protection Division of the United States Secret Service, her address was classified information. Even the neighbors wouldn't know what she really did for a living. When people asked, she'd offer the vague but believable cover story that she worked in federal law enforcement consulting. It was close enough to the truth to be comfortable, but far enough to maintain operational security. Marcus worked as a software engineer for a defense contractor, which meant he understood the need for discretion better than most spouses. Their lives ran on schedules that most people couldn't fathom. Sarah might be gone for weeks at a time, traveling with the president to summits, campaign events, or undisclosed locations. When she was home, she cherished the quiet normalcy of suburban life, walking their golden retriever, Sergeant, tending to her garden, and simply being invisible. The house closed in early March, and they spent the first few weeks settling in, meeting neighbors, and learning the rhythms of Riverside Meadows. The community seemed friendly enough. There was Tom and Linda Patterson next door, both retired teachers who brought over a casserole the day the Chens moved in. Across the street lived the Rodriguez family with their 3 energetic kids, who were always playing basketball in their driveway. 2 houses down were the Millers, a quiet elderly couple who spent most of their time on their screened-in porch. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The Homeowners Association made itself known exactly 3 weeks after the Chens moved in. Sarah was in the front yard, planting hydrangeas along the walkway, still in her gardening clothes with dirt under her fingernails, when a silver Mercedes SUV pulled into her driveway. A woman emerged. Late 50s, severely styled blonde hair, designer athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. The woman didn't introduce herself with a handshake or a welcome. Instead, she stood at the edge of the driveway with her arms crossed and announced that she was Patricia Hendricks, president of the Riverside Meadows HOA, and she needed to discuss several violations. Violations? Sarah had barely unpacked. Patricia proceeded to list them with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed delivering bad news. First, the hydrangeas Sarah was planting were not on the approved plant list, which was outlined in Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants. Second, the Chen's mailbox was the wrong shade of black. It needed to be replaced with one in the approved color, which Patricia could provide for only $250. Third, their garage door had been left open past 7 p.m. on 2 occasions, which violated the community aesthetics policy. Sarah listened quietly, her training kicking in. She was accustomed to dealing with hostile actors, though usually they posed actual threats rather than complaints about flower choices. She calmly explained that she'd reviewed the HOA documents before purchasing and didn't recall any of these specific restrictions. Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes as she responded that there had been several amendments passed at board meetings and ignorance wasn't an excuse. Before leaving, Patricia handed Sarah a thick envelope containing copies of violations, fines totaling $675, and a warning that future infractions would result in liens being placed against their property. Marcus arrived home that evening to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents, with that particular expression she got when analyzing a threat assessment. She'd spent 3 hours reading through every single page of the HOA governing documents, amendments, and meeting minutes that she'd pulled from the county records office online. What she discovered was disturbing. The amendments Patricia referenced had been passed at meetings with barely any attendance, sometimes with as few as 5 homeowners present out of a community of 230 homes. The fines had increased dramatically over the past 4 years, Patricia's tenure as president. And most troubling, there was a pattern. Certain homeowners seemed to rack up violation after violation, while others, presumably Patricia's friends, had pristine records despite obvious violations visible in their yards. But Sarah wasn't one to escalate unnecessarily. She wrote a polite email to Patricia explaining that she'd be happy to comply once she received official documentation of when these amendments were properly ratified, along with proof that the required notice had been given to all homeowners as mandated by state law. Patricia's response came at 11:30 p.m., a single line stating that the fines stood and payment was due within 14 days. Have you ever dealt with someone who mistakes politeness for weakness? Keep watching, because that's exactly what Patricia was about to learn the hard way. What Sarah didn't know yet was that Patricia Hendricks ran Riverside Meadows like a personal fiefdom. Over the next several weeks, Sarah would learn that Patricia had systematically pushed out every homeowner who dared challenge her authority. The previous family in the Chen's house had moved specifically to escape Patricia's harassment after she'd filed 18 violations against them in a single year, including citations for their children's toys being visible in the backyard. The violations against the Chens began multiplying with impressive creativity. Sarah received a citation because Sergeant's bark could allegedly be heard from the street during daytime hours. Another violation came because their trash cans were visible from a certain angle if you stood in a specific spot 3 houses away and looked through a gap in the hedges. Marcus got cited for parking his car facing the wrong direction in their own driveway for 20 minutes while unloading groceries. Each violation came with its own fine, ranging from $50 to $200. When Sarah requested evidence, photos, timestamps, the specific covenant being violated, Patricia would respond with vague references to bylaws and remind her that the HOA board's decisions were final unless appealed at a hearing, which wouldn't be scheduled for 60 days and required a $500 administrative fee just to request. It was a perfectly designed trap. Fight the system, and you'd drown in fees and bureaucracy. Give in, and you'd be funding Patricia's power trip indefinitely. Sarah paid the first round of fines, not because she believed they were legitimate, but because she was gathering evidence and didn't want to give Patricia any ammunition for escalation. She was treating this exactly like she'd treat any security threat, methodically documenting everything, identifying patterns, and preparing for multiple scenarios. She started talking to neighbors, quietly, carefully, just friendly conversations over the fence or at the mailbox. What she learned was enlightening. Tom Patterson next door had been fighting the HOA for 3 years over a citation about his roof shingles being a quarter shade different from the approved color. He'd spent over $8,000 on legal fees and had gotten nowhere because Patricia had stacked the HOA board with her friends who voted as a block on everything. The Rodriguez family had been cited for their children's chalk drawings on their own driveway. The Millers had been fined for having their curtains closed during daytime hours, which allegedly violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. But the most revealing conversation was with a woman named Jennifer Wu, who lived on the next street over. Jennifer had served on the HOA board 2 years ago and had been systematically pushed out after she started questioning the finances. She told Sarah that Patricia had created multiple special assessment fees that never seemed to result in any actual improvements to the community. The playground equipment that was supposed to be replaced 3 years ago was still broken. The community pool had been closed for renovations twice, yet looked exactly the same. Thousands upon thousands of dollars were disappearing into administrative costs and vendors that Jennifer suspected were connected to Patricia somehow. Jennifer had tried to call for an audit and suddenly found herself buried in violations. Her teenage son's car was cited for being parked on the public street, which technically wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. Her garden shed was declared non-compliant despite being identical to 20 other sheds in the neighborhood. After 8 months of harassment and $12,000 in fines and legal fees, Jennifer had simply given up and stopped attending meetings. Are you starting to see the pattern here? This wasn't just about petty rules. This was about power, control, and possibly something even more corrupt. But Patricia was about to make a mistake that would change everything. It happened on a Sunday in late May. Sarah had been away for nearly 2 weeks on a protection detail. She'd returned home Friday night exhausted, spent Saturday catching up on sleep and household tasks, and Sunday morning decided to take Sargent for a long walk through the neighborhood. She was in comfortable workout clothes, plain black leggings, a gray zip-up hoodie, running shoes, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone looking, she was just another suburban woman walking her dog. She'd taken a route she hadn't explored yet, winding through the streets on the far side of the neighborhood. Sargent was well-trained and walked perfectly at heel, stopping obediently at every corner. They were on Maple Ridge Lane, admiring a particularly beautiful garden when Sarah heard a sharp voice behind her. She turned to see Patricia Hendricks standing on the lawn of a large colonial-style house, wearing a designer tracksuit and holding a garden hose in one hand. Patricia's eyes narrowed with recognition, but instead of a greeting, she demanded to know what Sarah was doing on this street. Sarah replied calmly that she was walking her dog, gesturing to Sargent, who sat calmly at her side. Patricia's face flushed red. She announced that this was a private community and Sarah needed to provide identification proving she lived here. Sarah pointed out that Patricia obviously knew who she was, having issued multiple violations to her home over the past 2 months. Patricia's response was to demand Sarah leash her dog. Sarah lifted the leash that was already attached to Sargent's collar. Patricia then claimed the dog was too close to her property and was threatening. Sargent, a therapy-certified golden retriever who spent his spare time visiting children's hospitals, sat placidly looking at a butterfly. The interaction was bizarre and Sarah's training kicked in. She recognized this behavior, someone looking for confrontation, for any excuse to escalate. She'd seen it in protesters who wanted to provoke security into making a mistake. The best response was calm de-escalation and removal from the situation. Sarah simply said she'd continue her walk and have a pleasant day. She turned to leave. That's when Patricia said something that made Sarah stop. Patricia announced that she knew Sarah hadn't been properly vetted by the HOA, that her background check had raised red flags, and that she was calling an emergency board meeting to discuss the Chen's residency in Riverside Meadows. Sarah turned back, confused. There was no HOA background check. That wasn't legal under fair housing laws. And what red flags? Their finances were impeccable, their background was crystal clear, and they'd passed every check the mortgage company required. Patricia's smile was triumphant as she explained that the HOA had the right to approve or deny any sale in the community, and there were concerns about Sarah's frequent absences and the lack of information about her employment. There were questions about why Sarah's vehicle had government plates. There were suspicions about exactly what the Chens were hiding. Now things were getting dangerous, but not in the way Patricia thought. Sarah's cover was protected, but not bulletproof. Someone digging into her background aggressively enough, asking the wrong questions in the wrong places, could potentially compromise operational security. Not to mention that she was becoming concerned about how Patricia had even noticed her absence patterns or her vehicle plates. Sarah kept her voice level and professional as she informed Patricia that she was walking away now, and Patricia could contact her through proper written channels if there were actual HOA matters to discuss. She turned and began walking. She heard Patricia shout that she was trespassing and needed to stop immediately. Sarah kept walking. Sergeant stayed perfectly at heel. Then she heard the distinctive sound that she'd been trained to recognize instantly, the mechanical click of a gun being cocked. Sarah's body reacted before her conscious mind caught up. In a fraction of a second, she assessed the threat, calculated distances, evaluated cover options, and identified 3 different response scenarios. She turned slowly, hands visible and empty, using her body to shield Sergeant. Patricia Hendricks stood 20 feet away, holding a small revolver pointed in Sarah's general direction. Her hands were shaking, her finger nowhere near the trigger guard, her stance completely wrong. This was someone who owned a gun, but had probably never properly trained with it. That made her more dangerous, not less. A nervous amateur with a loaded weapon was one of the hardest threat profiles to predict. Patricia's voice was shrill as she announced she was making a citizen's arrest for trespassing and threatening behavior. Sarah needed to sit on the ground with her hands visible until the police arrived. Every instinct in Sarah's body was screaming to disarm this woman. She could cover the distance in under 2 seconds, have the gun secured, and Patricia on the ground before she could even think about pulling the trigger. But that would expose her training, raise questions, and potentially blow her cover. So instead, Sarah did what any reasonable person would do. She raised her hands slowly, spoke in a calm, even tone, and told Patricia that she was pointing a gun at a federal agent, which was a felony. She strongly suggested lowering the weapon immediately. Patricia laughed. A federal agent? Right. Sarah was clearly lying, probably a criminal, and Patricia was protecting her neighborhood. Sarah tried once more. She explained she was going to reach into her pocket for her credentials slowly. Patricia screamed at her not to move. Sarah froze. She calmly stated that Patricia had 3 seconds to lower the weapon before this became a federal incident that would destroy her life. Patricia's response was to yell at a passing car to call the police because she'd caught a dangerous trespasser. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone make a decision that you knew would ruin their entire life? Because that's exactly what Sarah was witnessing. The police response was fast, less than 4 minutes. 2 patrol cars arrived, officers emerging with hands on their holstered weapons, trying to assess the situation. They saw a well-dressed woman holding a gun, pointing it toward another woman who stood calmly with her hands raised, and a golden retriever sitting obediently next to her. Patricia immediately began talking, words tumbling over each other. She was the HOA president. She'd caught this trespasser walking through the neighborhood without permission. The woman had refused to identify herself, had made threats, and Patricia was making a citizen's arrest. One officer, his name tag read Martinez, approached Patricia first and calmly asked her to lower the weapon. She complied, though she kept talking, insisting the officers needed to arrest Sarah immediately. The second officer, a younger man named Officer Brooks, approached Sarah cautiously and asked for identification. Sarah kept her hands visible and explained that her credentials were in her right jacket pocket. With the officer's permission, she slowly retrieved a thin black wallet and handed it to him. Officer Brooks opened it, and his entire demeanor changed instantly. He looked up at Sarah, then back down at the credentials, then at his partner. He called Martinez over, showing him the ID. Sarah watched both officers' faces cycle through recognition, shock, and concern. Martinez immediately turned to Patricia and informed her that she needed to hand over the weapon immediately and put her hands behind her back. Patricia's confusion was almost comical. She demanded to know what was happening, insisting these officers worked for her through her tax dollars and needed to do their jobs. Martinez's voice was firm as he repeated the command. When Patricia hesitated, he explained that she'd just committed aggravated assault on a federal agent with a deadly weapon, which was a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. The color drained from Patricia's face. She stammered that there must be a mistake. Sarah hadn't shown any identification. How was she supposed to know? Martinez pointed out that Sarah had verbally identified herself as a federal agent, and Patricia had continued to point a loaded weapon at her. As Martinez handcuffed Patricia, Sarah finally lowered her hands and called Sergeant to her side. Officer Brooks asked if she was all right and if she needed medical attention. Sarah assured him she was fine, and this was handled professionally. She retrieved her phone and made 2 calls, one to Marcus and one to her immediate supervisor at the Secret Service. Within 10 minutes, 2 more vehicles arrived. An unmarked SUV carrying 2 Secret Service agents from the agency's field office and another police car carrying what appeared to be a supervisor. The neighborhood was now a crime scene, with officers photographing evidence, collecting statements, and securing Patricia's weapon. Patricia, sitting in the back of a patrol car, seemed to understand the magnitude of her mistake finally. She was crying, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. She'd only been trying to protect her neighborhood. Officer Martinez explained that it didn't matter. She'd pointed a loaded firearm at a federal agent. The fact that Sarah had remained calm and hadn't drawn her own service weapon was the only reason this hadn't ended much worse. Neighbors had started gathering, watching from porches and lawns. Sarah could see Tom Patterson, the Rodriguez family, Jennifer Wu, and dozens of others she didn't know yet. Marcus arrived, pulling up quickly and rushing to Sarah's side. She assured him she was fine, explained what happened, and watched his face cycle from relief to fury. One of the Secret Service agents, a man Sarah had worked with named Derek Chen, no relation, approached her and quietly asked if she wanted to press charges. Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, this wasn't about revenge, it was about safety. Patricia had pointed a loaded weapon at someone. Today, it was Sarah who was trained to handle it. Tomorrow, it could be a teenager cutting through the neighborhood, someone's housekeeper, or a lost delivery driver. Patricia was arrested on the scene and transported to the county jail. The charges were extensive: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, assault on a federal officer, brandishing a firearm, and illegal detention. The local prosecutor, once informed about who exactly Patricia had pointed a gun at, added federal charges. This wasn't going away with a fine or apology. But here's the thing, this was just the beginning. Because when you commit a federal crime, especially one involving a Secret Service agent, you don't just get arrested, you get investigated, thoroughly. And Patricia Hendrix's entire life was about to be turned inside out. Does your HOA president have skeletons in their closet? Patricia certainly did, and they were about to come tumbling out. The Secret Service doesn't mess around. When one of their agents is assaulted, they investigate with the same intensity they'd use for a presidential threat. Within 24 hours, agents had executed search warrants on Patricia's home, vehicles, and office. They seized computers, phones, documents, and financial records. What they found was fascinating, and they shared the basics with Sarah since she was the victim. Patricia Hendrix had quite a background. She'd been involved in 2 previous legal disputes in another state, one involving fraud allegations at a nonprofit she'd managed, and another involving harassment charges filed by a former neighbor. Both cases had been settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements and sealed records. But the investigation also uncovered something else. Patricia's behavior towards Sarah wasn't random. In her computer files were dozens of photos of Sarah's house, her car, her schedule patterns, and handwritten notes tracking when Sarah was home versus away. There were screenshots of Sarah's limited social media, searches for her name in various databases, and even an email to a private investigator asking about background check services. This elevated things from an HOA dispute to stalking. Patricia had become obsessed with proving that Sarah was somehow unfit for the neighborhood and had been building a case before the confrontation ever happened. The prosecutor added stalking charges to the growing list. News of the incident spread through Riverside Meadows like wildfire. What neighbors learned depended on who they talked to. Still, the basics were clear. Patricia Hendricks had pulled a gun on a neighbor who turned out to be a high-ranking federal law enforcement official, and she'd been arrested on serious charges. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 3 days after Patricia's arrest. Without their president, the remaining 4 board members, all Patricia's friends and loyalists, seemed lost. They'd rubber-stamped her decisions for years without question. Now they were facing potential legal liability, angry homeowners, and a lot of uncomfortable questions. Jennifer Wu, the former board member who'd been pushed out, saw her opportunity. She started organizing. She knocked on doors, sent emails, and created a Facebook group for Riverside Meadows homeowners who were fed up with the HOA's management. Within a week, she had over 80 homeowners actively engaged and sharing their stories. The stories were remarkably similar: excessive fines for minor or fabricated violations, harassment of anyone who questioned Patricia's decisions, suspicious finances, and a culture of fear where homeowners were afraid even to plant flowers without approval. Several homeowners shared documentation showing they'd been charged for services that were never performed or been fined for violations that didn't exist in any governing documents. Marcus and Sarah, meanwhile, were dealing with a different situation. Sarah's identity as a Secret Service agent was now public knowledge in the neighborhood. Her cover was blown. She had to meet with her supervisors to discuss whether this compromised her position, whether she and Marcus needed to relocate, and what the security implications were. After a thorough assessment, the decision was made that Sarah could stay in the home. Her specific role and the details of her work remained classified, but the fact that she worked in federal law enforcement was now known. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. What mattered more was that no one had discovered her exact position or assignment. Neighbors' reactions were mixed. Some were embarrassed that they'd lived next to someone protecting the president and hadn't realized it. Others were angry they hadn't been told, though Sarah pointed out that's precisely why it's called undercover work. But mostly people were supportive and more than a little impressed. Tom Patterson brought over coffee and an apology for not standing up to Patricia sooner. The Rodriguez family's kids left a poster they'd made thanking Sarah for her service. Even the quiet Millers came by to share that they'd been terrified of Patricia and were relieved someone had finally stood up to her. The preliminary court hearing for Patricia happened 2 weeks after the incident. She'd bonded out for $50,000, hired an expensive attorney, and appeared in court looking drastically different from the powerful HOA president who'd ruled Riverside Meadows. She was pale, anxious, and kept her eyes down. Her attorney tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that Patricia had simply been trying to protect her community and had no idea Sarah was a federal agent. The prosecutor's response was devastating. Even if Sarah had been a regular civilian, pointing a gun at someone on a public street for walking their dog was illegal. The fact that the victim happened to be a federal agent simply added additional charges. The judge wasn't sympathetic. Patricia was looking at potentially 5 to 7 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. Her attorney requested a continuance to negotiate a plea deal. Granted, but remember when I mentioned that federal investigations are thorough? The Secret Service had shared its findings with local prosecutors, and the local prosecutors had shared them with the IRS, the State Attorney General's office, and the county prosecutor handling civil cases. Because Patricia's financial records revealed something extraordinary: years of embezzlement and fraud involving HOA funds. Please stick with me because this is where the story gets truly satisfying. The forensic accounting was damning. Over the past 6 years of Patricia's presidency, approximately $234,000 had gone missing from HOA accounts. The scheme was elaborate, but once exposed, surprisingly straightforward. Patricia had created multiple vendor accounts for services supposedly provided to the community. Landscape maintenance was billed monthly, but was only performed sporadically. Pool service contracts that charged premium rates for work that was never done. Administrative fees that were deposited into accounts that Patricia controlled. She'd even billed the HOA for legal consultations with an attorney who, when contacted by investigators, had never heard of Riverside Meadows HOA or Patricia Hendricks. The special assessments that homeowners had been paying for years, they'd been padding Patricia's accounts. The violation fines had been increasing, pure profit funneled into shell companies. The vendors whom Patricia insisted were the only approved service providers, either fake companies she'd created or real companies paying her kickbacks. Jennifer Wu had been right to call for an audit. If Patricia hadn't been so determined to push her out, the scheme might have been discovered years earlier and the losses minimized. The state attorney general's office got involved because this wasn't just fraud. It was fraud affecting over 200 families and potentially violating state laws governing HOAs. They filed civil charges seeking restitution and requesting that the HOA be placed under temporary receivership while a full audit was conducted. The remaining board members, when confronted with the evidence, immediately resigned. 2 of them hired attorneys, terrified they'd be implicated even though they claimed they'd known nothing about Patricia's schemes. The investigation would determine their involvement, but initial evidence suggested they were simply negligent and incompetent rather than criminal conspirators. They'd signed off on documents without reading them and approved budgets without questioning obvious discrepancies. Jennifer Wu was appointed temporary president by the property management company that held the HOA's master insurance policy. Her first act was to suspend all pending violations and fines pending a complete review. Her second was to hire an independent auditor to examine every transaction from the past 7 years. The audit took 3 months and filled 4 binders with documentation. The final tally was even worse than initially estimated. Patricia had stolen or misdirected over $290,000. She'd used HOA funds to pay for her personal landscaping, her Mercedes SUV lease, family vacations she'd disguised as HOA conference attendance, and even her daughter's college tuition through a fake scholarship program she'd created. Criminal charges piled up, multiple counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, filing false documents, tax evasion, and money laundering. Combined with the assault and stalking charges from the gun incident, Patricia was looking at potential decades in prison. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in being lenient. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a systematic pattern of theft and abuse spanning years. The breach of trust was profound. She'd stolen from her own neighbors, from families who'd trusted her to manage their community. The civil suits started immediately. The HOA, now under new leadership, sued Patricia for restitution. Individual homeowners filed personal lawsuits for the fines they'd paid for false violations. The property management company sued for breach of fiduciary duty. Patricia's husband, who claimed he knew nothing about any of this, filed for divorce. Patricia's entire life imploded. Her house went into foreclosure when she could no longer make payments. Her cars were repossessed. Her country club membership was revoked. Friends disappeared. She went from being the powerful queen of Riverside Meadows to a social pariah facing financial ruin and prison time. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, 8 months after the gun incident. Patricia's attorney advised her to take a plea deal, plead guilty to the assault charges and most of the fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years with the possibility of parole after 3, plus restitution of all stolen funds. She took the deal. At sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. 17 homeowners stood up to speak. They talked about the stress, the anxiety, the fear of coming home to find another violation notice. They described how Patricia's harassment had affected their mental health, their families, and their sense of safety in their own homes. Jennifer Wu described being driven to the edge of financial ruin defending herself against false charges. Tom Patterson explained how he'd developed stress-related health problems from the constant conflict. Sarah chose not to speak. She'd submitted a written statement but didn't attend the sentencing. She'd done her part, she'd pressed charges, testified to investigators, and provided evidence. She didn't need to see Patricia sentenced to find closure. When it was Patricia's turn to speak, she offered what her attorney probably hoped would be a heartfelt apology. But it rang hollow. She claimed she'd been under enormous stress, that managing the HOA had been overwhelming, and she'd made mistakes. She avoided taking real responsibility, focusing instead on how difficult things had been for her. The judge wasn't moved. In his statement before imposing sentence, he noted that Patricia had held a position of profound trust and had systematically abused it for years. She'd terrorized her neighbors, stolen their money, and when challenged, had pointed a gun at someone. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior showing complete disregard for rules, laws, and basic human decency. Sentence: 7 years in federal prison, no early release, followed by 5 years supervised probation, full restitution of $290,000 plus interest and penalties. A permanent felony record that would follow her for life. Patricia was remanded into custody immediately. She'd serve her time in a federal prison 3 states away. Are you feeling satisfied yet? Because the story still isn't over. There's one more chapter about what happened to Riverside Meadows after Patricia's reign of terror ended. With Patricia gone and the old board disbanded, Riverside Meadows had to rebuild from the ground up. Jennifer Wu, along with several homeowners, including Marcus Chen, Tom Patterson, and a retired corporate attorney named David Kim, formed an interim board focused on transparency and reform. Their priority was financial recovery. The HOA's insurance covered some of the stolen funds, but not all. The community faced a choice: pursue maximum restitution from Patricia, who had virtually nothing left, or accept partial losses and move forward. They chose a middle path. They'd pursue what they could reasonably recover, but wouldn't bankrupt the community trying to squeeze blood from a stone. The second priority was governance reform. They completely rewrote the HOA bylaws with input from homeowners. The new rules included mandatory annual financial audits by independent firms, term limits for board members, maximum 2 consecutive 2-year terms, transparent budgeting with quarterly reports to all homeowners, violation limits. No homeowner could be fined more than 3 times per year without a hearing. Clear, specific rules replacing vague aesthetic standards. Mandatory homeowner votes on any special assessments over $500. Board meetings are held monthly with required public notice and open attendance, electronic voting options to increase participation, an ombudsman position to hear complaints about board decisions. They reduced the violation fine structure dramatically. Most first-time violations became warnings. Fines were capped at reasonable amounts and had to be based on clear, specific rule violations documented with photographic evidence. The approved plant list was eliminated. Homeowners could landscape their properties however they wanted as long as they maintained them. The paint color restrictions were loosened to allow any color within a reasonable palette. The garage door rule was gone. The mailbox specifications were simplified. Within 6 months, Riverside Meadows transformed from a community living in fear of their HOA to one where the HOA actually served its residents. Board meetings went from secretive affairs with 5 attendees to open sessions with 50 or 60 homeowners participating. Decisions were made collectively, not by fiat. The community used recovered funds to make improvements that had been promised for years. The playground was renovated with new equipment. The pool underwent legitimate repairs and upgrades. Common areas were improved. Trees were planted. The neighborhood became genuinely nicer, not just superficially compliant with arbitrary rules. Sarah's role in all this was quietly appreciated. She didn't want attention or recognition. She'd simply been a homeowner who'd encountered a criminal and handled it professionally. But neighbors understood that her presence, her training, and her willingness to stand up to Patricia had been the catalyst for positive change. Tom Patterson planted a tree on the property line between their houses and jokingly called it the Liberty Tree, celebrating freedom from HOA tyranny. Sarah laughed and helped him plant it. The Rodriguez kids continued playing in their driveway without fear of violations. Jennifer Wu planted whatever flower she wanted. The Millers opened their curtains wide. Marcus and Sarah settled into the normal suburban life they'd wanted. Sarah continued her work protecting the president, now without having to hide quite as carefully. Neighbors understood she'd be gone sometimes and didn't pry. When she was home, she was just Sarah, walking sergeant, tending her garden that now featured unauthorized hydrangeas, and living peacefully. One evening, about a year after the incident, Sarah and Marcus were sitting on their back porch watching the sunset when Marcus asked if she regretted how everything had unfolded. Sarah thought about it for a long moment before responding. She didn't regret it at all. Yes, her cover had been compromised. Yes, the situation had been dangerous. Yes, the following months had been complicated. But Patricia Hendricks had been a criminal terrorizing an entire community, and she'd been stopped. Over 200 families now lived in a healthier, happier environment because someone had finally stood up to a petty tyrant. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She spent her professional life protecting the most powerful person in the world from sophisticated threats, yet her most significant local impact came from simply walking her dog and refusing to be intimidated by an HOA president with a gun. Sometimes the threats that need confronting aren't the ones you train for. Sometimes they're just small-time bullies who've never been held accountable. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand your ground and let justice run its course. Patricia Hendricks made a catastrophic miscalculation that spring morning. She believed her position as HOA president gave her authority she didn't legally possess. She believed someone who appeared non-threatening must be weak. She believed her years of getting away with harassment and theft meant she was untouchable. She was wrong on every count. The weapon she pulled wasn't just pointed at Sarah Chen. It was pointed at her own future, her freedom, her entire life. That single decision to escalate a petty neighborhood dispute into a felony assault unraveled everything. The investigation triggered by that gun being pointed at a federal agent exposed fraud, embezzlement, stalking, and systematic abuse that might have continued for years otherwise. Think about the cascade effect of that moment. If Patricia had let Sarah walk away, she'd still be HOA president. She'd still be collecting her kickbacks and violation fines. She'd still be terrorizing homeowners who dared plant the wrong flowers. But her ego, her need for control, her absolute certainty that she was within her rights, it destroyed her. The broader lesson for Riverside Meadows was equally profound. For years, homeowners had lived under Patricia's thumb because they believed they were powerless. They thought the HOA had ultimate authority. They assumed that fighting back would be more expensive and exhausting than just complying. They were isolated from each other, each family thinking they were alone in being targeted. But once one person stood their ground, once the facade of authority cracked, everything changed. Homeowners discovered they had power in numbers. They learned that most of Patricia's rules weren't actually enforceable. They realized that an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. Now, what about the other HOAs? Did this story have any impact beyond Riverside Meadows? It did. Local news covered the sentencing, and the story went regional, then national. A high-ranking Secret Service agent having a gun pulled on her by an HOA president while walking her dog. That was the kind of absurd but true story that captured attention. News organizations started digging into HOA abuses more broadly, and Riverside Meadows became a case study in what happens when HOAs go unchecked. 3 other HOAs in the same county requested audits after homeowners raised concerns about their finances. 2 other HOA presidents in neighboring communities quietly resigned after homeowners began organizing and asking uncomfortable questions about vendor relationships and violation patterns. The state legislature even proposed new oversight requirements for HOAs, though whether that legislation would pass remained to be seen. Patricia's case became a cautionary tale discussed in property management courses, HOA board training sessions, and real estate law classes. Not just because of the gun incident, though that was certainly memorable, but because of how completely her abuse of authority had been documented and prosecuted. As for Sarah, she received a commendation from her agency for her handling of the situation. Her supervisors noted that she'd maintained composure under threat, followed proper protocols despite having the training to end the situation physically, and had conducted herself in a way that reflected positively on the Secret Service. The incident became part of training scenarios for new agents: how to handle threats while maintaining cover, when to reveal identity versus de-escalate, and the importance of following procedures even when you have the skills to handle situations differently. Sargent, for his part, received extra treats and belly rubs and remained blissfully unaware that he'd been at the center of a federal incident. He continued his therapy dog visits to children's hospitals and his role as the neighborhood's friendliest dog. Fast forward to a cool October evening, roughly 2 years after the gun incident. The Riverside Meadows community was holding its fall block party, an event that had been revived after years of being canceled under Patricia's leadership because she deemed it too disruptive to neighborhood aesthetics. The street was closed off, with families setting up tables, grills smoking with burgers and hot dogs, kids running around with glow sticks, and a sense of genuine community that had been missing for nearly a decade. Sarah and Marcus were manning their grill station, flipping burgers while Sargent posed for pictures with neighborhood children. Jennifer Wu was coordinating the whole event from a central tent, clipboard in hand, but smiling broadly. The new HOA board members were scattered throughout the crowd, not holding court or inspecting for violations, but simply being neighbors. Tom Patterson was teaching a group of kids how to make s'mores properly. The Rodriguez family had set up a basketball tournament. The Millers were seated in lawn chairs, holding hands and watching the festivities with contented expressions. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and music played while people danced or chatted or helped themselves to the potluck spread that covered 6 folding tables. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be: people enjoying each other's company without fear, without tension, without someone in authority looking for reasons to find them. A young couple who'd just moved into what used to be Patricia's foreclosed house approached Sarah hesitantly. They'd heard the stories and wanted to thank her for making Riverside Meadows the welcoming community they'd found when they'd moved in. They'd toured other HOA neighborhoods in the area and had been put off by the rigid rules and cold atmospheres. Riverside Meadows felt different, still maintained and attractive, but livable and warm. Sarah deflected the credit, pointing out that Jennifer Wu and the reformed board had done the real work of rebuilding. She'd just been the catalyst, and an unwilling one at that. But the young couple insisted, sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to back down from a bully for things to change. As the evening wound down and families started heading home, Marcus put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. He asked if she'd ever imagined, when they'd bought this house, that their suburban dream would include federal charges, HOA corruption, and completely transforming their neighborhood. Sarah laughed and admitted that no. That hadn't been on her list of expectations. She just wanted a nice house, friendly neighbors, and a place to relax between protecting the president from actual threats. Instead, she'd gotten all of that plus a front-row seat to small-scale tyranny and its downfall. But would she change anything? Marcus asked. Sarah looked around at the neighborhood, at kids playing safely, at homeowners enjoying their properties without fear, at a community that had rediscovered what it meant to be neighborly rather than just neighbors. She thought about Patricia sitting in a federal prison cell, hopefully learning that authority comes with responsibility and actions have consequences. She thought about the 200-plus families who now lived in a healthier environment. No, she wouldn't change it. Sometimes you end up exactly where you're supposed to be, even if getting there involves someone pointing a gun at you while you're walking your dog. Here's what Riverside Meadows teaches us about HOAs, power, and standing up to bullies. First, authority without accountability always becomes abuse. Patricia had power without oversight, and she used it to serve herself rather than the community. The moment homeowners implemented real accountability measures, audits, term limits, transparency, the abuse stopped. Second, bullies rely on isolation. Patricia kept homeowners feeling alone and powerless. Once people started talking to each other and organizing, they discovered they weren't alone and that collective action could create change. Third, sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is simply following the rules. Sarah didn't need to disarm Patricia or intimidate her with authority physically. She just needed to stand firm, let Patricia make her terrible choices, and let the justice system do its work. Fourth, small-scale tyranny is still tyranny. Patricia wasn't a dictator ruling a country, but to the families of Riverside Meadows, her abuse of authority affected their daily lives, their finances, and their peace of mind. It mattered, and stopping it mattered. Fifth, change is possible even in seemingly entrenched situations. For years, homeowners thought Patricia was immovable. It took one confrontation, one investigation, and one group of committed residents to transform the community completely. And perhaps most importantly, never assume you know who you're dealing with. Patricia saw a woman in workout clothes walking a dog and assumed she was dealing with someone powerless. She had no idea she was threatening someone who'd trained for years to handle far more dangerous situations, someone with the resources of the federal government behind her, someone who wouldn't be intimidated. That miscalculation cost Patricia her freedom, her wealth, her reputation, and 7 years of her life. So let me leave you with this question. If you're living under an HOA that abuses its authority, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep paying unjust fines and living in fear? Or are you going to start talking to your neighbors, organizing, and demanding accountability? Patricia's story proves that petty tyrants can be stopped. It just takes one person refusing to be intimidated and a community willing to stand together. And if you're an HOA board member who's been abusing your authority, considering following Patricia's example of corruption and harassment, think very carefully about what you're risking. Because you never know when the person you're targeting might be someone who absolutely will not back down, someone with resources you can't imagine, or someone who will be the catalyst for exposing everything you've been hiding. The gun Patricia pointed at Sarah wasn't loaded with enough bullets to shoot her way out of the consequences that followed. And whatever authority you think your HOA position gives you, it's not enough to protect you from the law when you cross the line from annoying to criminal. Riverside Meadows is proof that justice, sometimes delayed, eventually arrives. And when it does, it's absolutely satisfying to watch. Drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with HOA abuse? What happened, and how did you handle it? And if you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more stories of petty tyrants getting exactly what they deserve. Remember, stand your ground, know your rights, and never underestimate the quiet person walking their dog. They might be the one person you really shouldn't mess with.